Thank you so much, Annika, for a lovely introduction, and thank you for inviting me to come here today. I'm going to change up the talk a little bit from being science, although I do have a background as a scientist, to being very patient-focused, because as Annika said, I'm the CEO of Unique, and I thought I'd give you a quick introduction as to who Unique is. We are a UK-based charity, and we offer support and information to all those affected by rare chromosome and gene disorders that are associated with developmental delay and intellectual disability. We have over 30,000 family members from all over the world, from 120 different countries, but we are a tiny staff team. This is all of our staff here, and one of whom, Claire, who's here in the audience, who I'll introduce a bit better later on. And so I just thought I would bring, Andrew mentioned common conditions, and I'm going to be talking about rare conditions. And so I thought I'd sort of give everyone a quick overview of what we mean by a rare condition. So individually, rare conditions are rare, but collectively, if we put them all together, they occur in about 1 in 17 people. It's estimated that 8 out of 10 of these are genetic, and one of the things we know about rare conditions is they often take a very long time to get to diagnosis. So I often use this slide because although it's sort of slightly headache-inducing, it does show that really convoluted and long journey that lots of patients and families take to get to that final point of their final accurate diagnosis. So to roll back a little bit, well, I was thinking about giving this talk, and I was thinking about what has changed between 2004 and 2024. And we heard already this morning that actually in science and medicine there have been lots and lots of changes, but some things still stay the same. And I was thinking about this, and I thought, gosh, I'm watching the news and there's still the Israeli-Palestine conflict, and I thought, I don't want to think about the sad things, and then I thought about some other things that are less sad. I've got 2 teenage daughters that actually in 2004 we had Mean Girls, the first one, and we had a remake this year. I don't know how many of you have seen both of these, but with 2 teenage girls I have. And I also thought about my own personal journey into it through science. So I started off life in the lab, as Andrew was talking about earlier, and I spent 3.5 years sequencing 2 genes. It was a lot of effort and took a long time. And so now when we think about that we can sequence the whole genome in such a tiny amount of time, it really highlights how far we've come in terms of sequencing of the genome. And actually, it all goes round in a circle. So 2 of those genes I sequenced were called SON and DONSON. And now, at Unique, these genes have been identified as being involved in neurodevelopmental conditions. And so at Unique, we have families that have a change in the DONSON gene, and we also have lots of families that have a change in the SON gene. And so, you know, that whole circle of life, everything kind of seems to come back. And so what changed? I mean, really, Andrew's already talked a little bit about this, but this is a graph that's produced by the NIH every year where they map the cost of per 1 human genome. And you can see it came down, but really the steep decline in cost was around the time that next generation sequencing came in. So while I was doing my PhD and beavering away using Sanger sequencing, which is slow and laborious, although really super accurate, next generation sequencing is much, much quicker and much, much cheaper. And so this graph shows Moore's law, which, for those of you who don't know, is about computer power doubles every 2 years. And so you get this sort of decrease in cost because computer power increases. And technologies that keep track of this are considered to be sort of good technologies. So when we think about sequencing, sequencing has really massively outperformed that. And that's one of the technological advances that Andrew's already talked about. So when we're thinking about rare diseases, what's been the progress in the UK? And I'm going to focus on those rare diseases that we support at Unique, so those developmental conditions. And so back in 2010, the Deciphering Developmental Delay project was launched. And this sequenced 12,000 children and their parents who had severe developmental delay trying to look for an answer, a genetic answer to the developmental delay. This paper that I've highlighted here is just one of many papers that's come out of the DDD project, but I'm highlighting it because it was published yesterday, and some of you might have seen on BBC News and the news website some articles about this. So this is a real outcomes paper which summarizes a lot of the outcomes from that project. Another project that many people will be aware of is the 100,000 Genome Project, which was launched by David Cameron back in 2012 to sequence 100,000 genomes. Some of those were rare disease patients, again, looking for a cause of those rare diseases. And actually, David Cameron was on the news a lot yesterday as well in his announcing his new role as an advisor on the advisory board of the Oxford Harrington Rare Disease Centre. I thought I'd also mention this other project which was just launched this year, and this is actually not a diagnostic project, but a big project called the Generation Study, which is about using genomics to screen healthy babies instead of the heel prick test which we have currently. So as well as these big projects that have really changed rare disease research and diagnosis, we also have a lot more policy and service delivery in the last few years, and particularly in the last few years. And so Di and I were discussing earlier that the Genomic Medicine Service is not new, and clinical geneticists have been doing it for many years, but it got given this name of the GMS in 2018. And we have a lot of rare disease and genomic policies on the table. And so what's that all really meant in practice? So I'm going to use Unique as an example. Back in 2004, families who joined Unique, so those families that had a rare chromosome disorder, got that by having a carrier type test. So the clinical scientists would look down the microscope and see whether they could identify a chromosome disorder. Unique at this point had 4,000 members. One of the really important things we do at Unique as a patient support group is we produce really medically accurate and comprehensive information guides, which are also family friendly. So they're written in lay language, but they have all of those medical concerns and all of those things that parents and patients need to learn about their rare genetic condition. And back in 2004, we only had 7 of those guides to 7 different rare chromosome disorders. And although we already had some members from all over the world, we didn't have any translated. If you fast forward to 2024, families are now getting their diagnosis through these new technologies, including microarray and increasingly sequencing. And we have over 30,000 members. And in this period, as technology changed, our remit from supporting families with rare chromosome disorders has expanded to single gene disorders, actually really on the basis of the DDD project that I mentioned earlier, because as families were coming out the other side of that project with their diagnoses, it was clear that there weren't any patient support organisations for them to go to, and they sort of fitted our cohort of families, so we sort of took them in. We now have after all these sequencing technologies have been used in diagnosis, we now have members with 600 different single gene disorders. So you can see how that huge increase is happening. We've got over 300 information guides now to these rare chromosome and gene disorders. And I mentioned Claire in the Unique team earlier on that diagram, on that photo earlier on one of my first slides. And Claire's in the audience and is one of our 2 people who writes and produces all of those really fantastic guides. If you haven't seen them, please look on our website. You can download them. We've also got many of them translated into different languages. We have 22 different languages and a total of 540 guides translated. We've also recently started producing easy read guides, and we've got guides for children. So we've got all sorts of information, and that information project part of Unique's work has grown enormously. We're also keen to communicate science and information about rare chromosome and gene disorders in different formats. So we have quite recently produced 2 animations which explain to patients and families what a microarray is and what sequencing is. So I've talked a lot about this increase in diagnosis, which from when we were using karyotyping would identify a diagnosis in about 5% of patients to sequencing, where we're getting closer to 40 to 50%. But I thought it might be a good moment to think about why diagnosis is so important to families. So firstly, I showed that diagram of that enormously long journey lots of families get to their final and accurate diagnosis. And obviously, getting to that diagnosis stops that diagnostic odyssey. It provides patients and families with an explanation and a name for their child's features and symptoms. We hear often from parents that it takes a long time for them to be taken seriously, that their child isn't developing as they might expect. Often we hear from families that they feel guilty about that there's something they did or something they didn't do. So a diagnosis can provide peace of mind and lift some of that guilt that families often face. We hope that getting a diagnosis will give families access to better support and information through their doctors and also through patient groups like Unique. And one of the things we really hope will come, and is coming slowly but surely, is that getting more of these diagnoses and understanding more about the underlying genetic cause of these conditions will stimulate research, and we want to promote data sharing to learn more about these rare conditions. Another really key area of work that we do at Unique is putting families in touch with each other. So getting the diagnosis of a rare condition can be a really isolating and overwhelming experience for families. So it's really important to find others who are on that same journey as you. So we put families in touch with each other that either have the same rare condition, or we might match them based on their phenotype. So we might put families in touch with other families that have a child with epilepsy that is tricky to get under control, or who's struggling to toilet train their children. We can sort of match our families, and because we've got 30,000, we can almost always find a match for what parents and families need. The other important thing of getting a genetic diagnosis is, of course, it can help in reproductive decision making. What the chance of this condition happening again in your next child? And that's really helpful for families who want to expand their family and have more children. One of our families is a family who have written a BBC comedy series. I don't know whether anyone has seen this comedy series. It stars David Tennant, and it's a really true-to-life depiction of what Sean and Sarah's life is like with their daughter. There's 2 series, but I'm going to show you a short clip, which is from the special, which was launched last year. Well, I hope I'm going to show you a clip.
We found it. What? We've identified Rosie's condition.
Oh my God. Would you like to know what it is?
Rosie has a mutation on her 21st chromosome, a translation of a gene called DYRK1A.
Oliver Earl, please, Carol. Does this syndrome have a name?
Yes, DYRK1A syndrome.
We're going to need something snappier. What does it stand for?
Dual specificity tyrosine phosphorylation regulated kinase 1A syndrome.
No, that's not helping.
There's much more, but I'm only showing you a little snippet. If you haven't seen it, go and watch it. It's true. And for the clinical geneticist in the room, I don't know how you feel about your depiction here. But this does highlight one of the challenges of getting this sort of rare condition that families face. They will never have heard of it. They won't know what it means. So where they can go to get help and information is really important. So we went to our Unique members and asked them their thoughts and feelings about how genomics has impacted them. And again, I think this really highlights the importance of a diagnosis for patients and families, because unanimously, all of the responses we got were positive and what an impact it had on their lives. I'm not going to read all of them, but there are some really good phrases that we hear quite often. Genetics has joined the dots, said one family. Another family said, at the point of diagnosis, our family was in crisis. As a family, we now have the support and understanding we desperately needed to give our daughter the best life possible. Lots of people are really enthusiastic about genomics because they've been searching for this diagnosis for a long time, so when they get it, there's a sense of not just explanation, but relief that they've got there in the end. We hear words like, this is absolutely extraordinary. And this quite simple one, but we hear very often, from that moment, everything made sense. And I thought I would use one really recent example of a newly discovered cause of a neurodevelopmental condition. And that's because Andrew talked about protein coding genes, and those genes that are RNA code for an RNA but don't code for a protein. And all of our focus for so long has been on these protein coding genes, and we haven't looked as hard at those genes that are non-coding. But just earlier this year, sort of simultaneously, two groups, one here in the UK in Oxford and one in the US, identified a really not that rare cause of a neurodevelopmental condition in a non-coding gene. And this non-coding gene is RNU4-2, again, another snappy name for a condition. And actually, a combination of patients and researchers have given this name, and you can see it in OMIM if you look this condition up in OMIM, which is called Renew syndrome, which families like much better than RNU4-2. And this discovery was made by Nikki Whiffen and her team, and they were looking in one of those big consortium of data that Andrew mentioned earlier, and looking for a diagnosis for a lot of those undiagnosed families. So we mentioned earlier that with sequencing you get a diagnosis in 40 to 50% of patients, but of course there's 50% or more who still don't get a diagnosis. So there's lots of work looking at trying to increase the diagnostic rate for those people who are currently undiagnosed. And actually, if you take the undiagnosed patients whose DNA is in the Genomics England data set, this team found that a change in this gene occurred in 1 in 200 of those undiagnosed people with neurodevelopmental disorder. So we always knew that these RNA genes would cause conditions and would be impactful, but I think the surprise with this one was actually how common it was. And actually, when I talked to Nikki about this before, one of the things she said was that it popped up so much that it took them a while to realize that it actually was a real result and not an artifact, because they just couldn't believe how common it was. But it's also a really good example of clinicians, researchers, and patient groups all working together to support families better, promote research, and gather data share and gather information. So we have a number of families, quite a few families at Unique who've joined with this condition, but one of the mums in the States has set up a Facebook group, and Facebook, incidentally, also was launched in 2004. And the Facebook group for this condition has over 100 members worldwide. And this flyer you can see up here is advertising a Q&A session that we ran just last week where 70 families joined. We had Nikki Whiffen, who I've mentioned already, whose group made this discovery, Stefan Sanders and Anne O'Donnell, who also were involved in that discovery and have seen patients with this condition, answering questions from those 70 families. The families have now also set up a foundation so that they can start to raise money for research and are already liaising with researchers. So I think it's a real example of how that collaboration and partnership can really drive forward research. This down here is just a copy of the website, which is, as well as the Facebook group, there's been the launch of a website as well, where they want to put together all of the information that's being gathered and being learned about it. There's also been a podcast. There's a podcast for everything now, and this has a podcast. But the reason I put it up here is I really wanted this to read this quote because I think, again, it really highlights that enormous benefit of diagnosis for patients and families. And this quote is from Lindsay, who is a parent of a child who has Renew syndrome. And she says, so this feeling that like we've been on this deserted island for 8 years, and now all of a sudden you're sort of looking around through the branches of the trees. It's like, wait a minute, there are other people on this island. And in this case, actually, there's a lot more people on this island. Yes, it's exciting, it's validating. And this is the sentiment we hear really frequently from our families after getting a diagnosis. So, as well as asking them what they felt about this, the last 20 years, we then went back to our families and we asked them what their hopes were for the coming 20 years. And Andrew also touched on this earlier as well. And so the main themes that came up from the responses that we got from our families were about a quicker diagnosis, a wider access to genetic testing, more equitable access for genetic testing, and all of those sorts of diagnostic hopes and dreams for families. Also, as we would expect, lots of families talked about treatments and therapies for their child. And of course, in the news, we hear a lot about gene editing and CRISPR technology. And families all talked about wanting targeted, safe treatments and therapies for their children. We get lots of talks about cures, and the balance of that hype versus hope is a job, I think, for all of us in the room, so researchers and clinicians and patient groups, is how do we keep hope alive but manage those expectations for families. And this quote here, I hope they will find a cure for all genetic inherited disorders, one and all. So that's a challenge for all of you in the room that work in this area. The other thing that came out is actually not about technology or exciting genetic treatments. It's really about services and support and raising awareness of these sorts of rare genetic conditions. People are looking for understanding. They are looking for people who understand what their diagnosis is. And somebody says, we hope they'll get on board with the genetic diagnosis. So I think a lot of the work that needs to be done is actually that more sort of mundane day-to-day work of just promoting awareness about these sorts of genetic conditions and the needs of families and their children. And so I've really summarised all the things that we got from families, all of those responses for what they would like in the future, and of course that improved and equitable access to a diagnosis. So those 50% of families who are still undiagnosed are still looking for a diagnosis. We've talked, and Andrew mentioned this morning, is that sort of hope that there would be drugs and treatments, and perhaps the hope has not been quite realised yet. And actually, if we look at rare conditions, it's estimated that only 1 in 20 have approved treatment or medicine. Actually, from our position at Unique, that would seem actually an optimistic figure. So, and the other thing we really would like to see is improved day-to-day management and coordination of care for these families. And I also thought we couldn't really think about the next 20 years without mentioning AI, because that's a topic in the news. I often get asked to give talks for International Women's Day about being a woman in STEM, and I couldn't resist. I sometimes use this because I think it's really jazzy and fun about how few women there are generally in STEM subjects, but in working in AI, it's particularly small, so that's there. But of course, AI is being utilised across the board in medicine and genomics. On one of my earlier slides where I talked about service delivery and increase in policy, I mentioned that the NHS have these networks of excellence, and one of those is about genomics and artificial intelligence. Here at Unique, we have a really exciting and fantastic project with the University of Manchester and a really super clever organisation in India called Short Hills, and we have a project where we're looking to employ and utilize AI and machine learning to help produce information guides. You might remember from the stats earlier on that we talked about having 600 different gene conditions and also hundreds of chromosome disorders under the unique umbrella, and yet we only have 310 guides. So there's a big gap in the number of diagnoses we have and the number of guides that are available. And I also mentioned we're a tiny team with only 2 people writing guides, so we're really looking for ways in which we can employ this sort of technology to move forward that production of information that's so needed by families and patients, but also is really needed by clinicians who are seeing these patients who want to learn more about these conditions. And we know that clinical geneticists often give out these leaflets in their clinics to help explain the diagnosis to their patients. And so that's my whistle-stop tour of how the 100,000 Genome Project has changed the lives of many of our families. And so I just wanted to thank you for giving me the time to talk about patients and families, and thank our families who join Unique and share their data with us and share their experiences. But also I just wanted to show this picture of the book. Unique is the lucky recipient of one of these books of the DNA sequence of one of the chromosomes. So this is chromosome 21, which is the chromosome I started working on all those years ago. And you can't really see from this picture, but this book is a quite chunky tome full of just this huge sequence of letters, which makes up all of the sequence from chromosome 21. So I just wanted to thank you, and I'm happy to take some questions.